I am in studio with the Stick of Joseph today. And I know this isn't where I usually record episodes, but I am here and I'm so excited to interview you guys. This is just so cool. I saw you guys a couple weeks ago on the Mormon Stories podcast. I wasn't just like scrolling through and saw it. I think I saw you post about it.
Yeah.
Because I'm not typically a Mormon Stories like active
watcher,
or watcher. But I saw that and I was like, oh my gosh. I was just so proud of you guys.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It was an experience, a learning one in some ways, and it was good.
Yeah, it was fun, but it was nice to meet a future guest on your show, John DeLynn. I'm really excited for his episode for when he comes back. That's going to be awesome.
That is a straight up invitation to John DeLynn.
To come back to church.
We would love to see it. Interestingly enough, I had to give it a listen, and it was like 6 hours long. So it was
way too long. I would not even listen to it again.
I didn't finish it, but I did listen to the first part and the end part. First of all, the end part, I was like, my husband, we were driving up here to Salt Lake, and my husband was asleep, and I was like waking him up. I'm like, you gotta listen. It's so good. And I was just cracking up. But anyways, I was listening to your story in particular, Hayden. And I guess I didn't really realize that you had your own kind of comeback story. So when I was listening to that afterward, I messaged you on Instagram and I was like, I got to have you on the podcast. And then to have you guys together and you wear your testimony on your sleeve. And I love that about you guys. There's no shame, I guess, in sharing your testimony ever. And that is so cool. And I love it. So
thank you. Well, I think it's definitely a team effort. Like Jackson has always, and we talked about this a little bit on that podcast, Jackson's always been like the Nephi to my Lemuel sometimes, especially in high school, and finally we've linked arms together and putting on the armor of God. But yeah, like, what do you want me to talk a little bit about that?
Yes.
And so mine's not necessarily a comeback story. It was trying to figure out if I wanted to go, but then deciding, no, this is where I want to be for multiple reasons. And so kind of the 30,000 foot view is that probably about 7 years ago, I was dating a girl who was evangelical, and I didn't really think about the implications, but we started going on some dates and she started to ask questions. And it was the first time that she was kind of like pointing. It was like some uncomfortable conversation sometimes. I was like, wow, she's very bold on what she was saying about Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon. And I realized that I had never really challenged those presuppositions that the Book of Mormon could have been made up, that Joseph Smith, maybe he was a fraud, and maybe the temple isn't legit, and all of this sort of stuff. So for the first time ever, I opened myself up to that, and I said, I'm going to find out. I'm going to treat myself as if I am in what we used to call investigators, right? And I think we don't use that term anymore, but I'm going to put the church on trial and I'm going to see how it measures up, especially to like evangelical Christianity, even Catholicism. And so I had a faith in God and a faith in Christ, but I wasn't sure if this for sure was Christ Church. And that's kind of what got me on the journey. I go to Deseret Book, I buy Rough Stone Rolling, I start reading the CES letter, all of this sort of stuff. And it kind of, especially the CES letter, when I first got into it, like it was a couple days I was reading it where it was like, I felt this, I was like, what's going on? Like I started to really have some serious questions. And I learned a ton of lessons. One of them I talked about on the show of just, this wasn't my thought. It was definitely just from the Spirit, that I had this thought that I needed to make sure I spent just as much time reading, I guess you could say, pro-church material as I did things that were critical towards the church. I didn't learn this until Jackson and I were in the Marine Corps. So we're both in the Marine Corps together, we're both in the infantry. Jackson's actually a combat marksmanship coach. He went through a whole course teaching people how to shoot guns. And there's a lesson that we learned during our marksmanship that kind of helps inform and I think is very useful for people trying to dive into critical things to the church. You want to share that so I'm not talking too much?
Yeah, basically when you're teaching combat marksmanship, a lot of engagements, and we're not trying to pretend that we're something that we're not. We're not battle-hardened, freaking Captain Moroni type dudes.
We're training for that stuff, but we've never been in combat or anything.
Exactly. So I recognize how soft I am, okay?
All you veterans out there.
Nathan Bigler in the comments. Yeah. He's a Marine that hates us. But anyways, so when you're teaching that 25 yards and in, your target is, usually pretty small in terms of the grand scope of everything around you, right? And so we teach to keep both of your eyes open when you're aiming at your target, as to not get sucked into only what you can see out your little toilet paper tube of a scope, right? Because if you do that, then you're going to miss everything else going on the battlefield. And you may take out your target, but you may not see another threat coming outside of your little scope, right? And so when studying the gospel, and obviously I didn't have the exact same type of experience that Hayden did when he went through this period of deciding whether he wanted to stay. But as I've approached looking into critical perspectives of the gospel, I've kept that same motif of reading both sides and keeping both sides open so I don't get sucked into whatever I'm looking at. Because we've grown up in the church. We have studied, the scriptures, a lot of the LDS sources, but when you start learning things that are outside of the pamphlet, the missionary pamphlet of the Restoration, it's very interesting. And so it can be easy to just absorb all of that and be like, I grew up in the church. I already know everything they have to have as a say.
And so same as if you are on the battlefield and you see a new target, and if you close your other eye, like Jackson said, you might take out that target, but the battlefield is changing while you're not looking at it, and that's where it could be detrimental to you, and you don't get a clear view of the battle space. And so that's what I did. I spent reading as much critical stuff and positive stuff, and just reading my Book of Mormon every day, and reading my scriptures, the New Testament, the Old Testament. I think that really informed the final decision that I made. And I know that might sound presumptuous to some, where it's like, oh, so you got the secret sauce. And all I can do is speak from my own experience, that I knew I couldn't leave Christ. To me, the theology of Christianity is so rich and makes the most sense when it comes to justice, mercy, and just the grand scheme of things. It seems the most whole to me, and so I knew I wanted to stay in the Christian tradition. But where I wanted to go, and there were a few stakes or
pillars,
linchpins of why I chose the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints over all the other Christian religions. And so that was a period of time. It was probably about 6 months to a year where I was kind of going through that. And even my prayers changed. I started asking God, Heavenly Father, if this isn't the place I'm supposed to be, lead me to where I was supposed to be. And that was really scary to open myself up to that, but that's how it went.
And you were listening to Mormon Stories podcast, and
a ton, yeah.
Yeah, I heard that on your interview, and I was like, how interesting is this? Now you're a guest on Mormon Stories.
Yeah, but not like on necessarily the side of Mormon Stories, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I thought that was super interesting and I love that concept of keeping both eyes open, because there's so much stuff out there that is people get so sucked into it. I mean, we see it all the time in our YouTube channel comments, and I know you guys do too.
Yeah.
There's so many different sides, but one thing that I've noticed myself is that you can't argue your own personal experiences that happened. Like that can't be proven,
empirically.
Or is there evidence of this or whatever, but these spiritual experiences that you have, I mean, some people say they're, spiritual experiences or whatever, but spiritual things seem foolish to the natural man. I mean, when we're talking about spiritual things with somebody that is not a spiritual person, it can seem
like foolishness. Yeah.
And that's why I find so much value. I actually just thought of this before you said it, so it's so cool. But there's a verse in 2 Nephi chapter 9. It's in verse 39. It says, "O my beloved brethren, remember the awfulness of yielding to the enticings of that cunning one. Remember, to be carnally minded is death, and to be spiritually minded is life eternal." And so it was so interesting. As we've gone about this, we obviously receive a ton of hate from people that disagree with us. And at first, I would kind of like spitefully be snarky to them. But I started to be like, hey, send me a DM, let's talk. And then they'd send me a DM, and then I'd send them my phone number, and we'd get on the phone. And as
Wow.
I've talked to dozens and dozens of people, and after talking to John DeLynn, there's so many people that have become so carnally minded to the point that, for example, in that conversation with John DeLynn, we were talking about anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. And there's about, 34 different anachronisms that historical sources and archaeological sources haven't been able to fully, cross off the list. And we were talking to him about this, and we're like, John, let's say that all 34 of the remaining anachronisms, scientists and archaeologists, they dig them up and we find them. What's going to happen? He's like, I joined the church today. I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, I would. I'm like, well, what if there was just one on that list? He's like, it just takes one photo of Abraham Lincoln with an iPhone to disprove the whole thing. Terrible example, by the way. But it just shows that, okay, I'm coming from a place that I recognize that, yeah, the Book of Mormon isn't 100% archaeologically and historically proven yet. But I have approached this spiritual text by spiritual means, and I can't deny the experiences that I've had. And so I'm willing to go out on a limb, have faith that this is the word of God without having some dudes dig all the stuff up, which he's coming from a place that he's like, I'm going to trust in the arm of flesh, literally, to dig up all this stuff. And if they find it all, boom, then I'm back in, which I don't necessarily, maybe he's being 100% genuine there. But just like what you're saying, to be spiritually minded, you can talk yourself out of any spiritual experience.
Yeah.
You can find another reason. Oh, that's just a coincidence, or I can't trust my feelings.
And I think it's important to use all of our faculties. Jacob Hansen, I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head, but he essentially says, like, you don't just base off of feelings. So intuition and like spiritual feeling, that's one of the things, but you are also supposed to use your brain and reason things out, and 3 other things, but I can't remember them all right now. And so that's what's really important, and what I tried to employ during that period of time. And one thing that I ran into, and I learned a valuable lesson, was the unreliability of history. And what I mean by that, and some people, like historians, will be shaking their fists and be like, no, we know what happened and this is why we know. And it's like, I watch the news today and I don't know what's actually true. You know what I mean? I can have friends or family members that experience the same thing, and they have 2 different sides of the same story that do not line up.
So true.
Right now. Now add 200 years to that, and a super polarizing figure like Joseph Smith, it's going to be really hard to get a clear picture. Because guess what? If I read about what Brigham Young had to say about Joseph Smith, it's going to be biased and partially untrue. When I read what John C. Bennett and other critics had to say about Joseph Smith, that's going to be biased and partially untrue. And so the truth is somewhere in the middle. I don't know how far to either side, but I lean towards it's farther towards the Brigham Young side than the John C. Bennett side. But I just came to this conclusion, especially after reading, it was Rough Stone Rolling. I believe it's been 4 years since I've read this book, so I might be misremembering something, so you can fact check me in the comments. But there is this part, I think it's in the chapter about Joseph Smith's personality and characteristics. And there's a story about 2 men coming and visiting the Nauvoo house and staying a night there. And I believe one of them might have been John Adams Jr., so not John Adams like the founding father, but his son, John Quincy Adams, and then his friend. And they stayed there, and they both wrote in their journals that night about Joseph Smith. And one of them said, he seems like a humble but strong, charismatic leader that has strong morals and whatever. And the other one was like, I've never met a more pompous, ridiculous man ever in my whole entire life. And I remember reading that, and I was like, I can never base something as important as my faith tradition based on historical accounts. I'm sorry, I can't do it. I find it interesting, and I'm not saying it's completely unimportant, but I will never use that as the primary basis to decide whether or not I believe in the Book of Mormon or in the restoration of the gospel or temples or that Joseph Smith was a prophet. And so then it came down to, what is it that I can test? Because I can't meet Joseph Smith. I wish I could, and I could follow my own intuition on whether or not the guy was legit. So all I have now are the Book of Mormon, I have the Pearl of Great Price, I have the Doctrine and Covenants, I have the teachings of Joseph Smith, And that's what I'm going to test. How does it taste good to my soul when I read that stuff? And that is going to be the main basis, and the doctrines that were revealed through the restoration. That's what I'm going to base it on, not on historical hearsay, no matter how accurate it may be.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I'll get people that like come up to me and they're like, "Oh my gosh, are you Ashley with the Comeback Podcast?"
Mm-hmm.
And since, over the last 2 years that I've been doing this, I think all the time, what if they catch me yelling at my kids at the store?
Yeah.
Like I have so many imperfections, and what if they catch me on a bad day, and they think, oh, like,
she's the worst.
Yeah, it's
worst. All fake.
Yeah,
she's just faking the nice.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot when I think about, how we look at people in power and how we look at historical figures in the church, and everybody is human.
Yes, 100%.
And I look at President Nelson, and man, I can't think of anything anyone has to say of him being upset or not. He's just so kind and just.
But I'm sure there's someone out there that caught President Nelson when he was a 45-year-old dad on little sleep, and he was short with someone or a jerk. I guarantee it.
Right.
And so you have those accounts, and in the Marine Corps, we have this phrase that we say whenever something unusual or funny happens, where we go like the duality of man. One thing I saw in the Marine Corps is you have guys that on one end do not follow the same moral compass that we do, like in any way. But then on the other end, they're like, when it comes to Marine Corps things, they're the most trustworthy, service-oriented guys I've ever met in my life, where I know that they would take the shirt off their back and give it to me because I'm one of their Marines. And it's like those leaders. And so the duality of man is something that's really important to take into context here, where it's like, are there times where Joseph Smith did something stupid to someone, and then they take that and they're like, this represents his whole character? I guarantee it. That's why I just can't go off of hearsay of what other people had to say. So I'm just going to take what I know is as solid as possible. I know came from Joseph Smith, which is the Book of Mormon, Pro-Great Price, D&C, and then the teachings of Joseph Smith. So like there were a few things. I'll talk about a couple of the pillars that made it so like I can't go anywhere else in the Christian religion. The main, most fundamental one is the nature of God and Christ. As I would have these conversations with this girl, what would happen is we'd talk about tangential things. We talk about the necessity for baptism or ordinances or whatever, free will, things like that. And I found that we would always just end up talking in circles, and it would frustrate me until I realized why. There is a reason why, no matter how hard we try to come to grips and to agreement with our other Christian brothers and sisters on things about grace and works and baptism and ordinances and all that stuff, there's a reason why, and it's because we disagree about the fundamental nature of God in the very beginning. And because we disagree on the beginning, when we get out into the branches, into the tangential things, then there's no hope for agreement at that point. And the fundamental difference between us and the rest of the Christian world is that we don't believe that God created everything out of nothing. Joseph Smith, he explicitly says this in the King Follett's Discourse, but you can also find it in the Doctrine and Covenants and Pearl of Great Price. But he explicitly says in the King Follett's Discourse that our intelligence, he calls it, is co-eternal with God. That it has no beginning, therefore it has no end. And that matter has no beginning and no end. And so the creation that God was participating in was the creation of existing material and organizing that material. That is so fundamental to our belief as Latter-day Saints that is the reason why we will never agree with our Christian brothers and sisters on the other stuff, because there are some serious issues with believing that God created everything out of nothing. So the technical term for that, they call it in like theological circles, is ex nihilo creation. Ex nihilo is it Latin? It's Latin for out of nothing. So ex nihilo creation is what everyone else believes in, but there's some huge problems with that. One is, if God created everything out of nothing, then essentially he created beings to go to hell and beings to go to heaven. And he created beings that he essentially created the sins of all mankind in the moment of creation. Because if you have the main attributes of God, which is he is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, what that means, because he's all-knowing, the second, if we go ex nihilo route, the second he made Ashley out of nothing, gave her all of her attributes, all of her likes, dislikes, personality traits. He simultaneously, because he knows everything from the beginning to the end, created all of your future actions, all of your future sins. He knew how those traits would play out over time. And so that doctrine of creation out of nothing is fundamental to the rest of the Christian world, and the implications of it I can't get behind, because that means that God created us and then created a fake atonement for the sins that he created us to do, and that still that's not going to save everybody, and they're all going to go, there's going to be people that go to hell, and there is no justice, there's no mercy. It is a convoluted mess, is how I see it. And so that was one of the fundamental pillars. I can't find that beautiful doctrine that Joseph Smith put out, that we are co-eternal with God, anywhere else in the Christian world.
Yeah. And it was really interesting in that conversation on Mormon Stories where there's that verse in Alma 12 where it talks about after you have, forsaken the word, you will eventually not know nothing concerning the mysteries of God. It was so interesting when he was asking us questions, he was presenting to us the Protestant
Catholic version
of God, that he created all these bad things and he created us to sin and do all these things, when we're like, this isn't even what we believe, brother. And people got so angry with us when we're like, dude, you need to read the Book of Mormon. It's been 23 years since you read the Book of Mormon. And people are like, he knows more than you. He's read it more times than you. It's like, okay, well, obviously, if he's saying that, God created us to sin and that all the prophets in the Book of Mormon are chill with war, he needs to brush up on his Book of Mormon knowledge, because those are grave misunderstandings of what we believe.
Yeah, the Book of Mormon is the most anti-war book. And I wish, when we're in the moment, you always look back in retrospect and you're like, I should have said this. But it was a busy week. It was a really weird week, and my head wasn't in a super good space. But there's no more of an anti-war book in the world than the Book of Mormon. The whole civilization gets destroyed because they decide to live by the sword instead of live by the word. And so, if there's anything that's more anti-war, it's the Book of Mormon. But that's tangential. So that was one of the fundamental pillars of why I couldn't go anywhere else in the Christian world. The other one, because it was during that same period of time, I was working as a freelance videographer, and I had a lot of jobs that allowed me to travel around the world. So I got to go to countries in Africa, the Middle East, to Asia, India. During that same time, I was in India, and we were going on a long bus ride from New Delhi to a place called Dharamshala, which is up in the north. And it was 6 hours long. I remember we were just driving through these old villages, and I remember just seeing all these little kids in these remote villages that don't have electricity or anything. And I was sitting there, I'm just pondering on all of these things, on the evangelical Christian, Protestant Christian side of things, the Catholic Christian side of things. I was just to them, these people are going to hell, depending on the sect, because there are some Protestant Christians who don't necessarily believe that, but that is the fundamental belief, is these Hindu people that don't know anything about Jesus are going to hell. And I was just this is so unjust. I can't handle this. And so one of the other hard pillars for me is work for the dead, where it seems like the best plan I've heard so far of maintaining justice, where there are certain expectations that God has, but allowing for mercy because of the fallen world and because of mortality. And that was one of the things where I was just I don't find that anywhere else as explicit as it is in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, I love that. I want to kind of rewind back a little bit. So you are dating this girl. You're starting to do all of this research on different religions. How did you handle that? Where were you at during this time? And were you privy to this knowledge that he was doing this exploration? Or what was that like for you, seeing your brother start to question what you've known your whole life to be true?
So this is all while I'm out with a missionary tag on my chest out in Portugal. He sent me a few messages talking about how he had started dating this girl. Nothing too much about the type of research and stuff that he was going through.
Yeah, and it wasn't a super serious relationship. It was just, we went on a few dates, and after that, it's kind of just turned into tons of conversation. So I don't want to overplay the dating the girl side of stuff, but yeah.
Yeah, but it was just interesting to see, to me, if you watch the Mormon Stories interview, we talk about where Hayden was like in high school to where he was when even I came back from my mission, and how big of a change that was, I was able to see that with gospel questions that I still had and conversations that we had, I just saw so much more conviction in him after putting his beliefs on the table, dissecting them, and then finding those pillars in which he had to stake his faith on. It allowed me to see more conviction and also trust him more as a source to go to with my questions that I still had even after serving a mission.
Because some people will criticize, and they've criticized us on our YouTube channel as we've done episodes on the CES letter or things like that. They'll be like, why do you even spend time doing this? Why would I even read anything that is critical towards the church or the Book of Mormon or anything like that? And the reason is because even if it doesn't matter to you, it's probably going to matter to one of your kids. Mm-hmm. We can put our heads in the sand and pretend that everything's hunky-dory and then just hope that our children never come across anything that's critical. Or we need to grow up in our testimonies and be able to have answers for those things. That's how you be a missionary. You have to know what the critics are saying about the thing that you're defending if you're going to be able to properly defend it.
I have somebody really close to me that is kind of going through a faith wobble, and something that he's brought up is that it doesn't seem logical that the church would say don't look at anything that's antagonistic to the church. Mm-hmm. And he grew up being told that on his mission, and so that's kind of a sticking point for him. Why would they say, if this is the true church, why would they say don't look at anything? And I don't know if exactly where that started, but I think that by doing exactly what you guys are doing, which is looking at these things through a faithful lens, is extremely valuable for people that are our age and our children. With the internet, everything is accessible. You can look at it through a faithful lens. And actually what I found is that those really hard questions that were like, why did that happen? If we turn to God and seek answers, we can find resolution in our heart for those things. And maybe it's not going to satisfy all the people in the YouTube comments. And that's okay. But we can have that peace in our heart, and it can be resolved in our heart.
Yeah, I think as human beings, we want certainty as much as possible. I think it's a natural reaction for us to say, hey, don't look at anything that is going to make us feel uncertain. But what I will say is this, is that you cannot have an answer to a question if you don't have a question in the first place. So if we just live in the world where we're just consuming the answers to questions that we don't even have, we will eventually die spiritually because we never actually had any nourishing experiences where we had to wrestle with God, like Jacob, who later became Israel. His name means he who wrestles with God. And it's that experience, it's in that wrestle that we find ourselves, that we find truth. I just think it's really easy for us to get fat and lazy spiritually by going to church, just reading the church manuals, checking things off of the list, when it's like, have a question and then like really dig to it. And I think what happens a lot of times, I can't remember where we got this idea from. You might recognize there's like different levels of faith. So there's the A level, which is like the primary level where you just kind of like accept the general story of the restoration that's kind of in the pamphlet, right? It's just like the kind of 30,000 foot view. Some people will say that's dishonest. That's a dishonest telling. I don't think it's dishonest. You only have so much time to share the gospel with people. You can't give them a full thick thing on this is the full nuance of church history. You're going to tell the most important things that highlight what you believe to be true, right? So it's not that the church is going around lying and hiding.
Yeah, just imagine in a missionary discussion, like, and then Joseph Smith, to be a fruit of his prophetic calling, he got the golden plates and Oliver Cowdery helped him translate them. But then Oliver Cowdery fell away. He was excommunicated. But then a couple years later, he came back and then and just like go through all the messiness when it's like
where he had the first vision, but he had multiple accounts of it where like one of them he wrote this and the other one. And it's just like the church isn't going to do that. That's not their job. And even the most cynical critics of the church, I don't think that they believe that all of the apostles are BSing it. I think they believe that the apostles believe it's true. I don't know, even the most cynical, but okay, kind of getting off the rails there. So there's that 30,000 foot, just like only good level. And then there is the B level. That's where the mess is, right? And usually it's the complexity, right?
Yep. Or as Jared Halverson, creation, fall, atonement. You're in the creation phase where it's like, yes, everything's shiny and rainbows and this is so amazing. And then you go through the fall phase where you're like, oh, there is some really ugly past church history stuff that I have to grapple with. And then there's the atonement phase where it's like, there are these things, but actually it's really beautiful how we can take these pieces that don't make sense, but make sense somehow.
That's beautiful. That actually, I like that way better than the ABC. I don't know where we got the ABC from, but it's essentially that same thing where this is the level where the messiness is, right? And so you can choose to stay at that level though. And what happens, I think a lot of times, you stand in between creation and fall and you feel like you have to choose which one.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, well, creation seems naive and foolish and silly, so I'm going to stay on this side where everything's just messy, and then I'm just going to throw it out because it's all fake and a lie and all of this. I think that's what happens, where I believe in what Jared Halverson is alluding to is that once you make it through the fall onto the atonement side, it's where nuance exists. It's where you recognize the duality of man. It's where you realize that a perfect God is working with imperfect people through imperfect people.
Yeah.
And there isn't another way. I don't see another way where he isn't impeding on our agency.
Yep.
And that is kind of where I am now. And I find it to be actually way more interesting. I feel my faith to be actually alive. Where if you're just in the creation phase, you do not have living faith.
Right.
Your faith is stagnant. And just like it says in 2 Nephi chapter 2, it's talking about opposition in all things. It's talking about how you have to have good, evil, misery, pain, all this stuff. So he says, for it must needs be that there is an opposition in all things. If not, my firstborn in the wilderness, righteousness could not be brought to pass, neither wickedness, neither holiness nor misery, neither good nor bad. Wherefore all things must needs be a compound in one. Wherefore it should be one body, it must remain as dead, having no life, neither dead, nor corruption, nor incorruption, happiness, nor misery, neither sense or insensibility. So this idea of like, if you don't have the fall and the creation meeting together in the atonement, then your faith is just dead. It's stagnant. It is a compound in one. I think it's really important. We teach our children the creation level, but we have to help them grow. We can either cross our fingers and hope that they stay in creation world forever and they never experience the fall. They never see the messiness of life and of the restoration. Or we can go through it ourselves, make it to atonement, then walk back and hold our children's hands as they are going through the fall and helping them to get to the atonement side of stuff. And so I think it's ridiculous for us to think in the year 2024 that we're going to be able to hide messy church history things from our children. It's the same thing with like thinking that you're going to be able to hide your children from pornography.
Right.
It's not going to happen. So instead, grow up in your faith and then help your children as they grow up in theirs.
And in the book Faith is Not Blind by Bruce and Marie Hafen, they talk about how it's simplicity and then complexity and then simplicity beyond complexity. That book changed the way that I look at the gospel.
What's it called again?
Faith is Not Blind.
Okay, cool.
That and Crucible of Doubt I recommend to everybody. They're both life-changing books, but they talk about that. And there's been things in the past, like one of the examples it gives in the book, it talks about how there was a talk given at BYU about how women should be in the home and be mothers. And that's actually something that I've personally, because I have a career, I am a working mom, and that's something that there are talks in the past that really discourage that. And, I really strive to do everything I can. And so that was something that
really
I was
hard.
like, how do I put this together? And in the book, there was a talk given at BYU, and all of these girls, they were just didn't know what to do. Like, okay, this was the counsel we were just given, and we're in school to have careers. And then it just goes on to say how, we have personal revelation. There are different things that we have to figure out for ourselves. That's one of the things that I really learned, is that there are hard questions and there are things that we have to face. And when I first started coming back to the church, everything was so black and white for me, so black and white for me. And I realize that I say this a lot. Anyone that is a Taylor Swift hater probably hates when I talk about this, but she has this line in one of her songs that says, "Love isn't black and white, it's golden." And that is how I feel about the gospel.
Yeah.
It's not black and white. It's actually golden. It's like a step above that. And that is what the atonement is. It's not this simplicity or complexity. It's beyond that.
For sure. I think it's black and white thinking that causes us to miss the Messiah. So a lot of times we look back at the New Testament and we're like, how did the Jews miss Jesus? You know what I mean? Like, how did so many people miss Jesus? It comes back to what I was saying earlier. We want certainty. And so even though we might look back at the law of Moses and be like, oh, I'm so glad we don't have the law of Moses and all of the 400 laws or whatever, I think deep down, a lot of people want that. They would rather have that. They don't want to do their own thinking and their own spiritual wrestling with God. They'd rather just someone say, this is what you do on Sundays. This is what you're supposed to wear to be modest. This is what you're supposed to, whatever. And we just want that because it requires less work on our end. It has this facade of certainty and of authority. I sustain the brethren and I sustain the leaders of the church and I take their counsel very seriously. I will never, ever just leave it to, okay, they'll do the thinking for me because I will spiritually die if that happens. President Nelson cannot receive salvation for me through him. Like, I have to receive salvation.
Yeah.
I have to work my salvation out through fear and trembling with God. No leader can do that for me. I have to do that for myself. And so I look at our leaders as great examples and as people to help guide me along that path. But at the end of the day, we can't shove our spiritual well-being off on other people.
Yeah. My friend, she has just started coming back to the church and she hasn't missed a Sunday. She's been coming back for a couple months now and she's been out for probably 11 years. And this girl's been my best friend since second grade. Like, we go way back through all of our addiction days, all the things. And we've had the talk about coffee quite a bit, and she listens to the podcast, and so she's heard a couple times how we've talked on the podcast about how it's not necessarily that it's coffee, it's about giving something up that's hard for you to give up. I think about with the new show, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, and there's all these people commenting like, well, why can they drink this swig that is so full of sugar and it's going to kill you with all this soda, but you can't drink coffee? And like, how can they get all this like plastic surgery, but they can't do this? And and it's like, because we aren't commanded in all things. We are not commanded in all things. And it's funny how I think somebody in the complexity phase would look at the coffee thing and be like, that is dumb. You can't drink coffee and you can drink energy drinks, but you can't drink coffee, and that makes no sense. To me, once you move past the complexity and you're in, you know, simplicity beyond complexity, you can look at it and think, you know, that sacrifice, like once you've drank coffee and it's your part of your everyday routine, to give that up is really hard. And I personally believe it's about the sacrifice. It's not about what it is. And God isn't going to command us in every single thing. And the word of wisdom is it is specifically to help us take care of these bodies that are a temple. That's the thing that's so funny. We all do this to some degree. We're always trying to look for the dividing line. How close can we get here before we cross the line, right? And so that's a conversation with like Coke and Swig and all this and coffee and stuff like that. Then the question is like, okay, if I'm trying to take care of my body the best possible, and here's the thing, I had a Coke for lunch. Like, I understand. I'm not perfect at this. But what I'm saying is, I know at one point I want to get to the point where I just stop eating and drinking things that are not good for my body. I'm getting there. But that's where we're at. Do we want a rule for every little thing? Plastic surgery. Oh, thou shalt not do plastic surgery. Thou shalt do plastic surgery only if you had like some medical thing that happened to you and they're reconstructing your face. Well, you can have plastic surgery if like you got a mastectomy or like all this stuff. We can have all of these, but there's so much nuance in life where it's like, understand why the law is given and then ask God how you should apply that law in your life. You know what I mean? And I think it is important. And you know, the thing that's hard and why people are afraid of doing that is because here's the realm of certainty where it's like,
I'm certain about everything, and here's off the rails. In the middle, this place is where spiritual growth is happening, where I feel like the straight and narrow actually is. That's why it's called the straight and narrow. You have 1 foot in chaos, 1 foot in order, and that is the line of optimal growth. And it's scary because people can justify it that way too. They can be like, it's between me and God, and it's like this personal thing, and then they'll justify whatever they want. Like swinging, secret lives of Mormon wives. They're like, well, me and my husband, we've talked about this, and we made a covenant together, and we just feel like, this will help us revitalize our marriage or whatever. And it's just like, you can use these things to justify. So that's why people are afraid of it. But it is on that straight and narrow path, foot in chaos, foot in order, that we do have that optimal growth. So you can't shy away from it.
No, and I think it's interesting what you said about your friend having issue with the church saying, don't look at anything anti. And you might have even heard this as well, is in that conversation with John DeLynn, we realized we grew up in vastly different environments and vastly different teachings of what the church says. And so it's important to recognize that sometimes when people say like, oh, the church is this, and this, they mean my mom or my dad.
Yes.
And
I remember you saying that on the podcast, and I was like, yep, that is spot on.
Yeah, and it's so tough because you learned not a completely different, but a really probably different packaged version of the gospel in your home as we did in ours. And that's why it's so important, like Hayden's saying, to grow up and for ourselves have questions and find the answers in the scriptures and on our knees in prayer, because that's what our prophet is telling us when in the coming days, it will be impossible to survive spiritually if we don't have the constant guiding direction from the Holy Ghost. Yeah. And it takes a lot more work than we realize to gain that muscle of being able to be intact with the Spirit of God.
Yep.
Going back to like the whole, if you just want to stay in the creation and the primary understanding of things, like this was one of the frustrating parts with the conversation we had on Mormon Stories, is like he wanted to have like this long discussion about like a 6,000-year-old earth. And I'm just like, I'm so uninterested in it, first off. And two, what I felt like a lot of critics do is they get into the primary level of things, and then they try to argue that that's as deep as the gospel goes. And so unless you subscribe to the primary answers of these things, like the superficial level, then you might as well join them in just forsaking it all. When it's like, why don't you gain some depth in your faith instead of thinking that if the earth isn't 6,000 years old, and if there wasn't this neat little garden, that is explained exactly how it went, that you should just throw the rest of it out? Or like I said, and I don't mean this to be, because I'm still growing in my faith as well, but all of us just need to grow up in our faith.
Yeah. I interviewed somebody on the podcast, and his episode was just, it blew my mind, because he talked about how he was a very just scientific brain, and he was like a computer programmer. And he said, I picture it like a Minecraft game. You create this world and everything's there in the world, and, but there's like older trees and stuff in the world, but like the world was just created in the Minecraft game. And I was like, yes, I get that. And that episode was so interesting. So anyway, I just thought I'd bring that up.
Oh, that's cool.
Talking about the 6,000-year-old earth.
Yes. No. And so I think it's just really important that we have questions about the scriptures. We have questions about, why do we actually go to the temple?
Yeah.
Why do we do these things that the rest of the world is telling us are cultish?
Yeah.
Why do we wear special clothing under like every single day? Why? Like, that's a good question to ask. Don't be afraid to ask, because there are answers, and they're freaking awesome answers. They're amazing answers. And that's what we do on the Stick of Joseph. We bring people on that have better answers than us to these questions. Yeah. And it's so spiritually enriching, but you will never find the answers to questions that you don't have in the first place. You have to have the question first.
Yep. I've been reading this book recently called Crucial Conversations, and it talks about how we have different stories in our mind. If you turn your head and start laughing or something, I could create this huge story in my mind of, he's laughing at me. What the heck did I do? Why is he laughing at me? And I think it's similar in the church. We see something like polygamy, and we're like, that is so creepy. Why would he do that? That doesn't make any sense. I'm so creeped out by this. But then if you look at all of these different stories, like I talk often about an experience I had on my podcast where I was reading the Saints book, and there was a part about how Joseph didn't tell Emma about bringing on another wife. And that was really a sticking point for me. I was just like, how could he do that? How could he do that? And after praying about it and really trying to find some resolve with that, and I went to my dad and I talked to him about it, and had the most incredibly spiritual experience answering my question about that. And I saw the situation with new eyes. It was like a different story. I first had this story of, wow, that is creepy. Why? And then I saw all these other possible stories. Well, maybe he didn't tell Emma because he didn't want to hurt her, or maybe this, or maybe that. Like, we just don't know what the possible story is. We have a set of facts that we know, and we just can have opened eyes and we can see things in a completely different perspective.
For sure. I agree. Going back to what I was saying earlier, a set of facts where it's like, even when it comes to questions, I understand why people have questions about polygamy. I have questions about polygamy and all that sort of stuff. If I'm ever asked to live polygamy, then I'm going to start finding like really solid answers for it. But like, to me, what's really important is like, what am I being asked to do? Like when I make covenants in the temple, what am I covenanting to do, and why am I being covenanted to do those things? And that's what I'm really digging into. And so I understand why polygamy, especially coming from a woman's perspective, but also from a man's perspective, it does not sound fun at all.
Right.
It sounds like a mess.
Yeah.
So it's messy, but I think it's important to always also just make sure that we're trying to make sure that we do the most important things first, and that the tangential things, which are not unimportant. Polygamy, I'm not saying it's unimportant, but what happens a lot of times is we can get just sucked down that route, and then we forget all of the central amazing things that we've already talked about this podcast, right?
Yep. I just barely got called as a LDS 12-step missionary with my husband. I talked to you about this a little bit, but I also have gotten numerous messages from people that are listeners saying, how come you haven't had anybody on who has overcome a pornography addiction? And I just thought it was so timely that our paths are crossing here when I just got this new calling.
Yeah.
And the calling is in the pornography addiction recovery meeting. And at first I was like, this is kind of foreign to me. I'm familiar with like drug addiction, but I am not really familiar with this. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to hear a little bit more about that and hear, your story of how you were able to overcome that, what that was like, and just share with listeners, because we've had many people reach out and they need some hope.
Yeah.
So
no, I totally get that. And I've spoke to probably about a dozen elders quorums before, and most of them YSA elders quorums. And what I'll do is I'll tell my story, and then I'll do something really unconventional that sometimes maybe people don't like, but I'll tell my story, and then I'll say, all right, so that's my story. Now, who in here has struggled with pornography in some degree or another? Raise your hand.
Does anybody raise their hand?
Everybody raises their hands.
Oh my gosh.
Like I'm telling, because once I open myself up and I'm just like frank and I just talk normal about it, in no way do I justify it. And knowing that so many people struggle with it does not justify it. It shows them like how big of a problem it is. But what I found is that in 2024, every young man's going to be exposed to it specifically, and young women more and more and more. It's actually happening too as well. But there's not a young man that's going to get away without being exposed to it. And most of them, because of how effective it is at exploiting our natural wiring, are going to be caught up in it to some degree or another. Now, not every guy struggles with it heavily, but a lot of guys do. And so I think it's really important to remember, and one of the biggest tools that Satan uses, is shame. We have grown up a lot in the church, but we had one lesson that I remember specifically. It was like a priesthood meeting, so it was like elders through deacons, right? It was like a Fifth Sunday priesthood meeting, and we watched a couple clips from Ted Bundy's final interview. And in there, he talks about how pornography played a role in him doing these atrocious things that he did, which were insanely evil. There's a couple reasons why that is not an effective tool. First, fear is not an effective tool to keep young boys away from pornography. It's just not effective. Second, it's not effective because it's unbelievable. If that's the case, all these young men struggle with pornography. Why aren't there a million Ted Bundys out there? So it's just a bad argument that way. But the third, and this is the most harmful of it all, is then you start to think, okay, well, I think it's ridiculous that if you struggle with pornography, you're going to become Ted Bundy. But my parents don't. Obviously, my bishop doesn't. That's why he showed us this video. If they think that I'm looking at pornography, then me and Ted Bundy are like standing shoulder to shoulder. Mm-hmm. And so it creates this shame where you just want to hide. You don't want anyone to know. And Satan, he wants to make you feel alone because then you isolate yourself. Yeah. Then when God calls out in the garden, Adam, where are you? You're hiding away. And that's what he wants you to do. He says, look, you're naked. Run away and hide.
Yeah.
That's something that's really important. And I think we're getting a lot better in the church. I don't fault my leaders for doing that because for a long time, pornography had to be on actual pages of a book.
Yeah.
Or it had to be at a video store or something like that. And kids, they just didn't have the same sort of access. Mm-hmm. And so what happens though, the internet comes out, smartphones come out, and they're all freaking out like, what do we do? Okay, well, we got to show them how bad it is. And it's not to say that pornography can't lead to really bad things, because it really can, and I'm not trying to diminish that. But what I'm saying is it's just not effective for teaching our young boys. We can't have them be afraid of it. Well, we have to show this is the negative effects that pornography will have on your life. This is what it will have on your marriage and your future wife. You don't want that. What's going to happen is you are going to feel tempted. You may even mess up. You probably will mess up in some way. But you have to repent. And this is how you repent. And if we talked about it that way, a culture of repentance instead of a culture of fear and shame, we would have a lot less hurt marriages. We'd have a lot more intimacy and openness within marriages between spouses. That's something that we have to do more of. We have to have an atonement, a repentance-based culture, specifically regarding pornography. And since I've been married, I've had relapses. I took care of most of it before I got married, but I've had a few relapses in the 5 years that we've been married. And I have to still have that openness with my wife. You have to ingrain that into this culture of repentance where it's like, you can mess up, but nothing has to be permanent. It's only permanent if you decide to hide it and then revel in it. You have to have that openness. And that's kind of a 30,000 foot view. Me and my wife, we used to have a podcast, and we're actually putting it up again because it got taken down because we changed our card and it stopped paying the fee to keep the podcast up. So they deleted it. So we're putting it back up. But we used to have a weekly podcast we have like 56 episodes where her and I actually talk about the subject of pornography together. Wow. And from her perspective of how she has worked with me and worked with it, and then from my perspective, and then we interviewed a ton of people on it. So
when we got called and they said that it was for the pornography meeting, at first I was like, I just don't know if I understand what I'm supposed to do here. And I was like, it's just so foreign to me. And my husband says, Ashley, every single guy you know has probably it's so prevalent. It's not just like a couple people. It is so prevalent. And he always references a Boyd K. Packer talk where he says, it's not if your young men look at pornography, it's when. Mm-hmm. I applaud you for talking about it without shame. It is what it is. And that is the way that we can look at it and handle it, is looking at it in a repentant way.
Yeah, we don't shrug it off. We don't say, it doesn't really matter. There's a couple of choices that we have. We can say, oh, pornography is good. And there are people that say that. They're just like, no, it's natural. Yeah. I would say it is natural, but what do we learn in the scriptures? The natural man is an enemy to God. Right. So natural does not mean good.
The caveat to that is when he doesn't yield to the enticings of the Holy Spirit. And if you can look me straight in my eye and say that when you watch pornography, you feel the Holy Spirit, like, okay.
I have nothing to say.
I don't think there's a person on earth that will say that. Right. And so just the inherent nature of it, it's obviously such a bastardized version of something divine and beautiful and, something that God has given us for multiple reasons. But it's definitely the world getting in and making it into something that it shouldn't be.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so people can say, oh, it's natural, it's fine, it's good. So we can do that. Or we can go down the road of just like, it is the end of the world. You look at pornography, you lose your innocence, and it's gone forever.
Yeah.
And we can tell our kids that. The equivalent of that is the bubblegum lesson. You know what I mean?
Right.
Where it's just like, it's so bad. It is so bad. Or we can say this. You are a young man that is filled with testosterone. You are going to have these things. You're not even going to be able to control it. It's so annoying to some degree, right? You won't be able to control it. Your job is to learn how to control it. Your job is to become a man that is chaste. And one lesson that is really important that I always teach people, chastity is not inherent and then lost. Chastity is something that grows over time. There are people who have never struggled with pornography, if you never cheated on their spouse or anything like that, that maybe aren't completely chaste. Because chastity is like, it's a mindset. It's something that you grow into. And I think what it is it's like a fully chaste person understands the full utility, beauty, and divinity of intimacy. Mm-hmm. And I think all of us are working with our spouses to discover that. And so it's not, oh, you were perfectly chaste and then you screwed it up.
Yes.
It's, no, you were never chaste. Learn how to be chaste.
Right.
And that's what it is. We have to teach our young men that their mission in life when it comes to their sexuality and everything is to learn to become chaste. And there may be some hiccups on the way, and you want to avoid the hiccups. Mistakes I have made in my life have caused my wife pain. There are things that if I could go back and I could smack myself up the head and say, don't do that, I would do that, but I can't do that. And so what I can do is live a life as chaste as possible and hopefully help others to not make those same mistakes. Mm-hmm. So you can't cavalierly just be like, I'm going to mess up. I'm learning chastity. Like, once again, there's like the fine line that you have to walk where you can try to justify things, right? But don't do everything you can to not make big mistakes. There were things that I did in my early 20s that hurt my wife that I didn't even know yet. Mm-hmm. And that makes me so sad. And this isn't used as a tool to scare or to shame people. What I'm saying is just be wise. Make decisions. Until you are across the altar with someone in the temple, the person you are with, that you are dating or you're making out with or whatever, could end up being someone that hurts the person that you will marry and that you love more than anything. So make wise decisions. And yeah, that's all I'll say on the subject, I guess. So
I love that. Thank you so much. Okay, you guys are so awesome. You're so smart.
That's not true, but
you're eloquent, you're smart. Yes, you are. And I am so honored to have you on the podcast. So thank you guys.
Thank you
For taking the time with me.
Appreciate it.
A lot of people have asked us how they can support the podcast, and we have created a Comeback Podcast merch line on our website, www.comebackpodcast.org. All of the money made from the merch goes right back into the podcast. So if you are interested in supporting the podcast and you want to purchase some merch, we would love it. Check it out. Thank you so much for being a supporter of the Comeback Podcast and listening to our episodes. It would mean so much to us if you would like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps other people be able to find us, and we want to share this message to everyone.